and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted to be with you, of course, as always. As we get started with this week's author interview, I do want to remind you that you should like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you are either listening to it or watching it on. That will help you to always know when there are new episodes, and it does help the algorithm as well, get it out to more viewers such as yourselves. If you want to support the podcast in a different way, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info. You can leave a tip or a donation. If you would like to also leave a question or comment there as well, I'd be happy to engage with those at the beginning of the next episode that I do. I love hearing from you and interacting, so please leave me comments or questions. Also, though, if you do want to support not only this podcast, but the network in general, please go to gsmcpodcast.info and you can support it in a monetary fashion. Thank you, as always, for any support that you give. It is greatly appreciated. You can say hi to my little dog right there behind me, who is staring at something at the moment. At any rate, welcome to today's episode. I hope that your week is off to a great start. It is Tuesday. It is sunny. It's almost always sunny here. I can't complain about that. I've got a weird something going on behind my head back there. But it's a good week so far. Not much to report. Just the usual, hanging out with the dogs and the hubby, going for lots of walks, doing a lot of work, doing a lot of meetings. It's the same thing that we tend to do, but it's an okay week so far. Yesterday was my middle niece's birthday. She is now 21, which is crazy because there's absolutely no way that I can have a 21-year-old niece when I am only 25. It just seems crazy to me. She is smack in the middle. When I say middle niece, I have 5 nieces and she's number 3, so she is smack in the middle. Although she's the youngest in her immediate family, like, birth orders are interesting when you have blended families because she's not the youngest with, she has a half sibling with her mom from a different relationship, so he's younger. And then, but she's, I don't know, she's the youngest, but she's not the youngest. She's the middle niece, so I don't know. I'm just making this up as I go along. It was her birthday. I love her. I miss her. I hope she has had a wonderful, wonderful day. I don't know if it sucks to have your 21st birthday on a Monday, but who knows? It is what it is, right? You can't control that. Let's talk about books. Let's talk about this week's book. This week I have author Jeff Hoffmann here. We are talking about his book, Like It Never Happened. Let me go ahead and give you the description of this book. Decades ago, 4 friends concealed a deadly secret, but not all lies stay buried in the psychological suspense for fans of Ashley Winstead and Allison Galen. 30 years ago, Malcolm, Henry, and Kevin, I said it like Tommy Malcolm was one person. 30 years ago, Tommy, Malcolm, Henry, and Kevin were best friends, graduating high school, brothers almost, until the night they did something terrible. The decision to keep hidden what they did in that parking lot shattered their friendship and warped their lives. But when Kevin, struggling with a heroin addiction, drives his motorcycle into the side of a truck, the other 3 find themselves together again at Kevin's funeral. When they meet Kevin's wife, Naomi, at the wake, they can tell that she knows everything. And when they learn that she's a reporter, they're terrified. When she sends him to visit one of their victims from that night at the nursing home where he's been suffering for decades, they do as they're told, even though they know it won't stop there. After watching her husband pay a steep price for keeping the friend's secret, Naomi has crafted a plan to make Tommy, Malcolm, and Henry pay their fair share. When the 3 men decide to fight back, they're forced to decide just how far they'll go this time. So that is the description of Like It Never Happened. Psychological suspense. We are back into this genre, although I will say, and Jeff's going to talk about this a little bit in the interview. Is it suspense? Is it something else? Is it... we're going to talk about what genre it really is. And for me, yes, there is some suspenseful elements in there, but this is very low on the eek scale for me. This didn't like have me... It's intense, don't get me wrong. It's dealing with consequences, it's figuring out relationships, it's moving forward. It is 4 men. I mean, Kevin is in the book but not in the book. It's men trying to deal with something terrible that happened, and what does that look like, and how do they move forward, and should they move forward, and should they have repercussions and consequences for their actions. So there's a lot of intensity that goes on in this book. So yes, it is very intense, but it is not terrifying. And we all know that is it terrifying and is it graphic? Those are my two things that I tend to try to shy away from. No, it's a page turner. It will keep you hooked. It is told from multiple points of view, so we get not only Tommy, Malcolm, and Henry's points of view, but we also get their significant others, their spouses' points of view, including Kevin's wife, Naomi. We get her point of view as well. And she is the one that is instigating this new change in their lives as she's driving things forward after Kevin's death. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Jeff so he can tell you more about the book. Again, it is called Like It Never Happened. The author is Jeff Hoffmann. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Great to be here. Thanks
Thank
for
you for
having me.
being here. I'm excited to have you to talk about your novel, Like It Never Happened. Before we do that, though, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself so that my listeners can get to know you.
Yeah, sure. I was born in St. Louis a long, long time ago, and I've lived in Chicago, the Chicago area since college. So I'm married with two children in their early 20s now, and I spent most of my career working in IT services. But in 2017, I quit to go back to art school, which is kind of a weird thing to do. I did that full time to get an MFA in fiction, and my first book was my thesis from that experience. And when I'm not writing and or spending time with my family, I play beer league hockey and sail on Lake Michigan. So that's
Nice.
the quick thumbnail of Jeff Hoffmann.
I know it's hard to sum up, decades of life in 2 minutes, right?
Right, but that's
But
what we do.
it's good. It helps you with your elevator pitch for books as well, right?
There you go. There you go.
This is psychological suspense. Like I said, it's called Like It Never Happened. Can you give an overview of the story?
Of course, four 18-year-old boys are best friends, and they do something terrible. And then over the weeks that follow, they argue about whether to take accountability for what they did. And those arguments cause their friendship to shatter, and they don't see each other until they're almost 50. And one of them, Kevin, dies of a drug-induced motorcycle accident. And the other three reunite at the funeral, and they think they're going to go up to the funeral and then go back about their lives. But they meet Kevin's wife, and they learn that she's a newspaper reporter, and that she's determined to make them pay for what they did. Well, what they that thing that they did 30 years ago drives the plot forward. For me, the story is really centered on the way that long ago night has warped their lives and all their relationships. And I kind of think of that event as the maypole that's at the center of the book, and that the family dramas are what the threads that get wrapped around that maypole, and those are the real story. And it's about secrets and lies, and it's about blame, and ultimately it's about accountability and redemption when you choose to take that accountability.
Yeah, it's suspense, but it's not the kind of suspense that is, kind of like horror or
Right.
like jump
It's
scares or
not
those sorts of things. No, it's really
yeah.
that character driven story. Are those the types of stories that you prefer to write as opposed to the more jump scare suspense? Or you
You know,
like
I,
both?
I, I've, I've found that, it doesn't really matter what I prefer to write. It's, what ends up coming out of the pen onto the page is what I write. I've always found that I write with pace, and suspense is where my mind drifts, and then, and where my writing drifts towards. So I don't read a lot of suspense, which is strange. There's suspense in all fiction, but
Yeah.
I tend to read literary fiction. But what comes out of the pen tends to be have some pace to it, and some the suspense that keeps people turning the page, hopefully.
Mhm. What was your initial inspiration for the story?
Unfortunately, I was in a parking lot with three other boys when I was 18. We didn't do any of the things in the book. I'm not confessing to any crimes, but I saw other people do some things that cross the lines that get crossed in this book. But they enough happened in that parking lot that I asked myself, it stuck with me, I guess is a good way of saying it.
Mm. Hmm.
And it's like you said, it's a psychological suspense, but really a thriller, right? It's not so much about what happened in the parking lot, but what happened afterwards. And what happened for me, or what I saw happen, was that a mundane thing that happens in parking lots all over the country every Friday night, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
terrifyingly mundane thing. But the it stuck with me, and that was kind of the kernel. And then from there, it was what if? What happens if you don't tell, and what happens if you don't take accountability, and how does that affect people when they're maybe partnered with people that know about it? And more interestingly for me, what happens to relationships from both sides of the relationship when there's something stuck there, right? Where there's something that is unresolved in the partner's life, and so I worked to make those three characters deal with it, and really four, the dead one dealt with it in a certain way, right?
Hmm.
But I worked to make those three characters. I explored. I guess a better way of saying it is I explored. Different ways of dealing with it or not dealing with it, with each of those characters, and
Yeah.
they they take very different paths, but none of them terribly healthy.
Yeah. And you tell the book from multiple points of view. So we don't just have one of these characters driving the
Yeah,
story forward. Were there challenges to telling the story from that many different perspectives?
yeah. There was a lot of point of views in this book. I think that's one thing that the that was certainly a challenge, right? The men and their wives all share a point of view, and Naomi, the wife of the dead man, also has her chapters from her point of view. And for me, when I think it's really important, and hopefully this comes across. I'd love your feedback. My goal is always to make it so that when you are reading, even if you picked it up in the middle of after you're five or six chapters in, if you picked up a chapter in the middle of the chapter and started reading, you would know whose mind you're in. But
Mm.
I think it's very intentional to anchor the beginning of each chapter with the point of view that you're in. The chapter, the first sentence always starts with something like, Tommy was, and
Yeah.
Malcolm, was doing X or Y or Z, but more importantly, I think I tried to frame each of the individuals within a certain mindset, right? For Tommy is a building engineer, so everything's about weight and plumb, and Malcolm is a corporate attorney or a mergers and acquisitions attorney, so everything's about leverage and negotiation, even when we're not talking about his work, right?
Yeah.
And Elena is a stay-at-home mom who's Italian and who cooks, and whose mother recently died, and so everything's about the ingredients and mixing and bringing things to a boil, and so I tried to find those metaphors that could kind of seep through all of their you know not necessarily their external. You can build a voice into the external, but the interior thoughts I tried to make very, very distinct, and not the way I would think, but the way each of the characters would think, so that
Hmm.
you would find yourself immersed in their point of view.
Yeah. And it would
What I
be
do.
no, yeah, it's very clear. Yes, to follow up, it is clear. I had no issue with figuring out who was speaking, which chapter was from which point of view, etc. And we are going to actually talk a little bit more about that when we come back, because he does. Jeff does change how those points of view are presented a little bit as we get deeper into the story, and as Tommy and Malcolm and Henry Harry, sorry, interact further. So we are going to pick up this conversation, but we are going to take our first break of the episode. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Yeah. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip, and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning, and this is just the beginning. I need a big change, help me feel like living. I need a big swing, home runs I'm hitting, and I'll never look back, moving on till I get it all. And we all got dreams, we all want things, but what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Jeff Hoffmann. As we get into this second segment, I do want to remind you one more time that if you want to support the podcast and the network as a whole in a monetary way, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info. You can also leave a question or comment, but at gsmcpodcast.info, you can leave a tip or a donation, which really does help not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. As always, thank you for every bit of support that you give, whatever form of support, whatever form that support comes in. It is greatly appreciated. So before the break, Jeff was talking about writing from multiple points of view and what challenges that might have presented. He asked, did he do an okay job of presenting whose point of view it was in each chapter? The answer to that is yes. I had no issues with that, but I just wanted to remind you of that conversation because we are picking up in the middle of that conversation and with my next comment. So let's return to that conversation with Jeff. There are some scenes, especially when Tommy, Malcolm, and Henry are together, where we switch very quickly back and forth between those three, but it's always from one, it starts out from one, but then in the midst of the scene, we'll get all three of those. Because those are very pivotal scenes in the book. And of course, I don't want to say which ones because we don't want to give too much away.
Yeah. And they only spend a certain amount of time together, right? A lot of their time is spent with their families and dealing with those ribbons wrapped around the maypole, if you will. But one of the things I tried to do, and I did this on purpose, and I've always been kind of a very, very strict point of view person, right? Where it's like never the same, never multiple point of views in a particular chapter or scene, right? But I actually took some risks there where I said, and it started. I tried to start it out slow, where the friendship scenes, when these friends come back together, they're a little bit disconnected in the beginning, so the these are very, very separate. And then as they start to come back together, and as they start to rekindle their relationship, not necessarily in a healthy way in the beginning, but start to remember where they were at. I started mixing their point of views because that was my way of helping the reader feel immersed in this friendship that was so deep for these individuals.
Yes, they become more and more enmeshed as the book goes on. Yeah, and it would be an incredibly different book if it was only from, let's say, Tommy's point of view. Like, I don't think you would get that same intensity. You could still maybe get the threads, but it would create a very different tapestry. So when it comes to your characters, did you, especially the three men that we see the most, and Kevin to a certain extent, but did you have really good pictures of them before you started writing, or did those characters develop as you write? How does that work for you when you start a book?
Yeah, so I try to define my characters at the beginning, but they tend to assert themselves in ways as I write. And I would say that the characters really take their sharp edges and become the most distinct during the rewriting process, and so they emerge in different chapters. And Malcolm, some of the like Tommy's a good example. Tommy kind of came from his first chapter, and I knew who Tommy was after I wrote his first chapter, and he just kind of fell in my lap. And Henry was a little tougher though. Henry's a complicated dude and not nearly as straightforward as Tommy. And I had to work and rework, and I would say the same thing with Henry's wife, Alice.
Hmm.
I had to work and rework them to make them coherent. And I would find a scene where I really, really liked what came from them. And then I would rewrite all the other scenes to follow that thread and follow that tone and follow that voice that I found as I wrote them. So some characters, stuck to the plan. And some characters demanded to be treated specially,
Yeah.
and then there's always that, you know, writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting where you take it from take what can be is always a sloppy first draft and it has the inconsistencies in character, and then you got to remember who you're dealing with. And what I do then is I typically take all my Henry chapters and I edit those all at once, and so that I'm very, very focused on Henry's voice and Henry's internal character throughout those chapters. Does that make sense?
Yeah. For you, how do you keep straight when you're writing from this many points of view timeline? Do you have a timeline that you then, I mean, I don't know, is there a spreadsheet in there, an app? How does that, is it just your
There,
brain?
there, yeah, I would say that I write a bunch of scenes, and then I build the spreadsheet that organizes those scenes, and then you run into a few timeline problems, and so you fix that in the text and in the narrative. But especially in this, where they kind of go off and deal with their own stuff, and then they come back and deal with this core problem, right? And so it's kind of a fun, it's kind of a fun puzzle to solve to make sure that everybody's timeline, their exterior timelines and their internal, their together timelines merge. And yeah, there's a spreadsheet that emerges from that. I wish I was one of those writers that can write that spreadsheet in the beginning and get their 18 beats before they start.
Yep.
But I tend to be I tend to have to follow the pen on paper, and that's probably not it's certainly not the most efficient way to write a book, but it's the one that I found that works.
Right. You have to do what makes the most sense for you.
Yep. Yep.
Whether it seems logical or not.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat cliche, but the characters tell you what the story is to a certain degree, right? I When I've tried to force characters to follow my story, they don't always. The story suffers, and
Yeah.
when the character and who they become as I write them dictates how they act, then it comes off. It becomes more natural and it becomes more inevitable.
Hmm. Were there any particular types of research that you did for the book?
So I'm one of those people that I I don't research in advance. I
Hmm.
research after I write, and partly because I've seen myself do it, and I've seen other writers do it when I was in school, where research can become a reason to not write.
Mm.
You also end up researching. You research a lot about what maybe doesn't become relevant, or you write about interesting things that you have learned in research,
Yeah.
which result in a bored reader.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to me because I spent all this time in the research. I will say that the place on this in this book where I spent a lot of time researching, or spent the most amount of time researching, was Henry's. Henry is a tissue broker, and
Yeah.
I knew I wanted something kind of icky, kind of off center and off center and kind of on the nose at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And I met a guy at a party, a long time back, and he said, "What do you do for a living?" And he said, "I'm a tissue broker." I'm like, "Oh, you work for a you work for an organ bank?" And he's like, "Well, not really." And we had these three or four questions until I got to the point where I'm like, "Ooh, I don't think I want to know anymore." And so
Yeah.
I read a couple books on that and just kind of couldn't stop. And again, I had these scenes that I had to take out because I was and a
Yeah.
couple of my early readers said that's kind of over the top, and that's a little bit too much from Henry. So
Yeah.
I tried to dial that back a little bit.
that could have been a totally different kind of suspense, veering into thriller,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Oof. Um, I guess I knew that in the, you know how you just never, you don't think about something. It makes sense
Yeah.
that these people and these jobs exist, but it's not something that I've spent time thinking. I wonder how that gets facilitated. Well,
Yeah.
thanks, Jeff. Now I know.
Are you going to have to live with that, Sarah? I
Now,
apologize for
just,
that.
yeah. It's good though. It's, you learn something from every book you read,
Right, right.
whether
And
you,
I think I tried to not just to make it something interesting that I put in the book, but the job he chose and the job he drifted into was
right.
not unrelated to what he had done in that parking lot.
Yeah.
And there was kind of a part and parcel problem that he was dealing with, and not or not dealing with is maybe a much better way of saying it with him.
Yeah.
And, and that was really what this book's about.
Yeah. And what I think you do a good job with is that these are just regular people. They're living their lives. They have
Yep,
families and spouses and children that are giving them issues, like, children sometimes do. And
yep.
yet they've got this other thing. And so, how did you, as the author, find the balance between this is a really horrible thing that y'all did 30 years
Yep.
ago, and you're
Yep.
also just these sort of normal, average, middle-aged men dealing with life?
Yep. And so I started with that inciting incident, right? And I knew I didn't want to make that what the book was about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make about I wanted to make the book about not dealing with that incident. And so I knew these people had fallen away, so it wasn't about, the relationship. It was part of that, right? But it's what did the denial of accountability, how did that affect bad things happen in everybody's life, right? That's,
Mm-hmm.
I'm 55 now. I've learned that lesson. And when bad things happen, and often when you're a parent, the worst thing that can happen is with your child, right? And that can be caused by you or caused, by circumstances. And how do you react to that? How do you deal with that? How do you, what are the things that these characters were inserting from their lack of accountability into the relationships that was causing that or making that worse? And that was really what I set out to do, right? And some of it was about children, some of it was about spouses. And I wanted to make it different in each of these threads so that I had room to explore, very, very different things, right? And it's a domestic suspense in essence wrapped around the center of a crime, right?
Yeah.
And it's three, and for the most part, three domestic suspense stories wrapped around the center. And I found that a lot of fun, right? To go to Denver and then go to Milwaukee and then
Mm-hmm.
head back to Chicago and then have those things happen and then have people come back together and deal with the central issue, even as they were
Yeah.
the things that are going on in their lives, right?
Yeah. And I think we really see that accountability piece with Tommy and his relationship with his older daughter, his oldest child,
Yeah.
in that
Yep.
he's trying to not force, but help her not make what he sees as a mistake. And, again, you never want to give too much stuff away about plot, but
Right.
he's trying to help her to not make a mistake, well, ignoring the fact, that he's not taking accountability for this mistake. It's a very interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, all those things are going on at once, and some of it's below the surface, and some of it he's realizing, and he's dealing with the accountability being thrust upon him. He's dealing with his wife is a district attorney,
Yeah.
and we'll have to deal with this in her world because it's the same county that she's
Yep.
a district attorney in, or she's a prosecuting attorney, I should say, and the same time that the wife kind of caused the problem with the daughter, and he's angry
Yeah.
about that.
Yep.
And so, and the daughter's making a terrible mistake, but he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be. He knows. I think a better way of it's not a question of what he wants to do, but he knows if he acts in certain ways, he knows in his gut that he's going to drive his daughter away.
Yeah.
But he wants to find a way to pull it back. That was a really fun thread for me to write.
Yeah. So you said you don't read a lot of suspense. What then do you think when you sit down to write and you start typing, what makes your fingers type suspense?
Well, I shouldn't say that I read things that are branded. One of the things that every time I've talked to an editor for the first time, twice, the uh, the first thing I ask, or one of the questions I ask is, how are we going to market this book? And the question they always answer is, I'm not quite sure. The way they always answer, and so one of my favorite books over last year was The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, um, literary masterpiece in my opinion, right? But suspense is at the center of it, right? And one of my favorite books of all time is Beloved by Toni
Mm,
Morrison. And
hmm.
suspense is what drives that forward, and it's not necessarily all pleasant teamline suspense, but Tony in that book builds suspense by dropping into the past, coming into the future, dropping into the past, coming into the present,
Yeah.
dropping back and forth, right? And so for me, suspense is what fiction is about, right? And then there's all the stuff that happens once you sell a book to a publisher, where they have to
Right.
decide how to brand it and how they're going to position it and what shelf it's going to end up on, and that's all stuff that I don't
Yeah.
really control or all that, right? I do. So I think that's the answer to the question. I don't really set out to write the best book I can, centered around characters that drives people forward to understand what happens. I don't set out to say I'm going to write a suspense novel.
Hmm.
But certainly that's how my last editor or my last publisher decided to. They almost. I think there's a little the cover screams thriller. I think a little bit
A little
more
bit. Yeah.
to it. Yeah, and I regret that a little bit. I regret leaning into that cover a little bit because there's a little bit of disconnect between. There's a lot of people that read it and say, "Hey, it's good," but it wasn't really what I expected, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned a little bit about covers from that, but because I think it's much more of a character driven story, and
Yeah.
um,
It's
I might
interesting though
suggest.
how you write something and you see it as one thing, but then you've got to go through 15, 100
That's
people, whatever it is, that then have to all
yeah,
figure out where it's going to go and how it's going to be marketed and how, yeah, what box
yeah.
it's
Then
going to
you're
fit
you're
in.
struck over the head with the fact that it is a business, publishing,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
no matter what you what art you try to infuse into what you write.
yeah. Two questions as we come out of that segment. The first is, am I talking with my hands more than usual? Has it gotten worse? I don't know. I know I've been doing video long, so you maybe don't have much to compare it to. I know I definitely talk a lot with my hands when I was only audio, but I think it's getting worse on the video. Not important. More important, do you think that all fiction is suspense? I think that's a really interesting question because it should have that level of suspense. It should be drawing us forward and into the story. I'm intrigued by that question and I'm going to think more about it. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, we will be talking a bit more about the authors that Jeff mentioned and how he worked them into a scene. So you are tuned into the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Jeff Hoffmann. Before the break, he was talking about what draws him to writing suspense, and is this book actually suspense? And what is suspense? Is all fiction suspense? Excellent question. Maybe you thought about it over the break. Maybe you'll continue thinking about it, but let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Jeff.
Side note, though, nice job working in the Toni Morrison reference into the one scene in the book. Good job.
Oh, great.
Um,
I think if you, if you want to know what I read that scene, right? That's those are some of my favorite books that are mentioned
okay.
in that scene where, for those who haven't read it yet, it's a woman who is deciding whether she's going to leave her husband and finds herself in, a man's, a man who's not her husband, on a date, examining his bookshelf and deciding what she's going to do, and having a conversation with him about that. It's good fun.
Which is a book nerd I love, that you're trying to figure out if you're going to have a one night stand with this man based on his bookshelf.
Right, right, right. Like she was ready to leave if he did. He had kind of acknowledged that he was drinking bourbon at the bar because his brother told him that's what you're supposed to do now that he's divorced, and she said if his brother staged these books, then I'm out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Probably didn't think you were going to be talking about that scene in an interview. It's completely random. Current works in progress. Are you working on anything new?
I am. I wrote I've written 90,000 words of a third novel, and it's a delightful mess, is what I would say. And I've been sitting on it for a little while, trying to figure out how I'm going to rewrite it because it needs
Mm,
work, right? It's about a man who he's a those gold shops that we buy gold, and they always have that the guy out front
mhm.
with the sign saying we buy gold, and
Yeah.
and he's the clerk in there who buys gold from people, and there's all the and he's a good person doing this bad thing, right, and trying to just get through life, and he's divorced, and on impulse he moved in next to his ex-wife to be close to his daughter without telling her, and the new husband kind of goes off the deep end and bad things happen,
Dear.
so I love the story. I love the characters. I just don't figure out what it's about, to be honest with you,
Okay.
and then tear out what it's not about because there's a lot of threads
Right.
that in the first draft, and rewrite and rewrite around it, whatever it becomes the core of the book. So it's a whole bunch of mess there that I gotta make something out of, and meanwhile, I've started maybe what's maybe a fourth book or what's maybe a third book. We'll find out, right?
Right.
I'm so the question that I'm asking myself is, the AI and misinformation are a thing, right?
Mhm.
Everybody may have heard that, right? So what happens after, in 10 years after that, after bad things happen because of that, and we get to a post-truth world, and where um, everybody's acknowledged that there's no way of knowing what's true and what's false, and I can choose my own facts and I'll choose my own world. And what happens for the people that straddle that world between, you know, I grew up in a place where there was objective truth, and now I'm living in a place um, where truth is not a thing anymore, right?
Mhm.
There's nothing solid, and people have found their way to be okay with that because of all the bad things that happened as alternative facts cause divisiveness. So playing with all those things, keep it kind of narrow, right? Like I think the interesting challenge I have is I don't want to make it like a sprawling Tom Clancy book, right? About
Mm,
all that, but I want to kind of keep it centered on this one family. One's a kind of an emerging adult autistic programmer. Another is an adult that has not quite found a way to emerge and turns to the megachurch as a way to anchor on truth. And one's a high school teacher who's struggling with the fact that the school board won't let her teach about slavery anymore,
mm,
and one's uh, a former Reuters editor who, of course, all the news organizations are bought by the single technology company that now exists, and he's really bitter because he's working a menial job. And
right.
so, what does all that mean, and what happens next, right?
Yeah.
I'm,
can
I'm
already
writing through that to find out what happens.
I can already guess that one's going to be marketed as suspense. Just seems like it's going to come across that way.
We'll find out, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm having fun, right? I know there's, you know, feeding my family based upon fucking novels. So I'm writing the things that interest me and the stories that interest me and trying to make the stories I can.
Yeah, that's the important
If they
part.
sell, they sell, right?
Yeah. We've talked about the current book and some of your works in progress. Do you want to give a quick overview of your first book as well?
Sure. It's very, very different book. My children are adopted, and so we're in that adoption community. None of this happened to us, but a uh, a family or a couple chooses to adopt after being unable to have children, and the biological way, and um, they adopt a baby girl, and the birth mother changes her mind. Within the window,
Mhm.
3 days after
Yep.
the baby's home with the couple, she decides to reclaim the baby, and then the couple decides to run, and mayhem ensues, and that also from multiple points of view, and I think what I would say that book is about is expectations, right? That everybody enters adulthood with certain expectations about what's going to happen, what opportunities are going to be available to their children, what how their family's going to play out, and then they act in certain ways when those expectations aren't met.
Yeah.
So playing with multiple different points of view with how different people react, and I think there's tried to make it so that there's no villains and no saints in the book, right? It's
Yeah.
not. It's you kind of. I've heard from multiple readers, many readers, that they approached the end of the book not really sure who they wanted the baby to end up with, and
Mm,
which was kind of the goal, right?
yeah.
There's a bit of a Solomonic, if that's a word. There's one baby, and we've got to decide. That's got to work out to see who raises this baby, and see how people act and react to the problem.
Yeah. Oof. Wow. Um, so in terms of writing, you decided to go get an MFA. That was a little later in life. Had you wanted to write? Was that something in the back of your head, or was there an an incident that said, you know what, I should pursue this? How did that journey work for you?
I've always been a really deep reader. My parents, so our TV broke when I was in second grade, and they didn't get a new TV until I was in fourth. And they said we all had to get on the honor roll at the same quarter, and it took us a little while. And so I read, and I never stopped. And I was always a reader, and always wanted to create something in that vein, right? And my job was in IT, and that that didn't scratch that urge to create something, right? And
Mhm.
and so I'd written a book in my early 30s that will forever remain in a drawer. And then, when I was in my, mid to late 40s, I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it now. Forever's not going to last forever. And so I quit and went back and said, let's carve out a couple years and really, do my best at seeing if I can do this, knowing that it's a long shot, right? And let's not let's not end up on the deathbed saying I wish I would have really tried.
Yeah.
So and then I got lucky. I worked really hard at it and treated it like a job, but I also got really lucky and that first book published with a big house and that was really, one of the most exciting days of my life. My daughter was there when I got the call from my agent. My daughter has autism, and she said, "This is the most exciting day of your life." And I because I reacted to it in front of her. And I said, "Yes." and then I had the presence of mind to say, except the day we adopted you, and the day I adopted your brother, and the day I married your wife, your mother, and
Good, good save.
so that was good saying. But yeah, it was one of those things that I had always dreamed about. And
Yeah,
I didn't really expect it to happen, but when it did, it was fantastic.
yeah, absolutely. So what piece of advice would you give to someone who is thinking, you know what, now is the time, I should just do this. I've been thinking about it forever.
I have children in their early 20s, so I've learned not to give advice.
Mhm. My kids are the
But
same
I'll
way.
say, I'll answer the question by saying, here's what I learned, right?
Yes.
That, and I read this in this Stephen King's book on writing a long time ago, that
Mhm.
there's a very small number of people that can just sit down and write a book and write a masterpiece. And there is a much larger group of people that can put a ton of work into it and put work towards the 10,000 hours, and that can, paraphrasing, of course, but they can, write something that they're not happy with, and then, then stick with it, keep rewriting and keep rewriting and keep rewriting. And my first draft of everything was horrible. Um, if I had quit there, I wouldn't have two published books. And
Mhm.
don't expect what you write. Everybody talks about the writing journey, and it is, and you can only do it if you love doing it. Is the other thing I would say, right? Or that right, that I loved the process, and I loved. I was a reader. I was actually in school with a another student that she said, "Well, we were presenting her on our favorite author, and she's like, well, I don't really read books." I'm like, "Why are you here?" Right? There's go if you want to be famous, go start a YouTube channel or something, right?
Yeah.
So don't read because you want to be a writer. Maybe write because you love reading.
Yeah.
And but the if you love it, there's much easier things to do than write a book. So don't do it unless you're loving the process, because it's an uneven and can be painful at times, and there's certainly rejection built into it. But if you're having fun with it, stick with it, because you put those 10,000 hours in, and good things can happen.
Yeah. Yep. Um, when you take the time to read just for you, what are your go-to authors and genres?
Yeah, so I kind of read, if I pick I'm kind of a list reader, to be honest with you. I hop between the Booker Prize and the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and stay away from the Nobel, because those tend to be a little bit more about politics than about literature in my experience. And then I read all the semifinalists and all the long lists, and then I read their next books after I love the books. So I'm kind of all over the place. It tends to be literary fiction, right? That
Mhm.
win those prizes, and I can tend to be a sentence or paragraph geek as much as a story geek, and just be knocked off my chair by I read, like I mentioned Paul Murray earlier. I mentioned Toni Morrison. Tess Gunty wrote a beautiful book called The Rabbit Hutch. That's her first book. So I've heard more from her. Claire Keegan, I just stumbled across. She writes really small books, but like every one of those sentences is, she spent the week on, I bet.
Mm.
And I've Cormac McCarthy. The last one really didn't do it for me, but The Road is one of my favorite books, and Ian McEwan. I think he's kind of one of those guys that builds suspense through dread, and he's kind of a guilty pleasure, I guess. But he,
Mhm.
he also he also writes with incredible art and intensity, right? Especially some of his middle work, right? And so yeah, those are some of the things I love, but it's just kind of all over the place, and I'll pick something up on a recommendation, and if I love it, I'll read another one.
Sure.
Two things that are equally true from what Jeff was just talking about with the lists that he reads from, and that is that one, I need to start reading more from lists like that. And two, I absolutely do not need to add more lists to the list of lists that I already have with my TBR. It's a problem. I need to work on it. I'll figure it out. I don't know how I'll figure it out, but I will try to figure that out. Not during the break because that's not long enough, but it's a work in progress. At any rate, let's go ahead and take that last break of the episode. When we come back, Jeff will be talking about, given some of the authors that he just mentioned and what he enjoys about their writing, does he tend toward perfection in his own writing? You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and my conversation with author Jeff Hoffmann. As a reminder, before the break, Jeff was talking about some of the authors that he really enjoys reading, and often those authors, especially like Cormac McCarthy, he really appreciates the way that they craft sentences and paragraphs, how well put together those sentences and paragraphs are. I just wanted to remind you of that because it does lead into my next comment. So let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Jeff. As a sentence or paragraph geek, does that ever cause you issues in your own writing? Do you find yourself sucked into trying to make every sentence perfect?
I, I would say that I'm not the, I read about or hear about other writers who churn a book out in a year or 6 months and start on their next book, and it takes another 6 months. And I guess it boils down to goals, right? I'm trying, I don't really get stuck, right? But I also keep rewriting until I'm really happy with it. And which is fine, and I don't feel stuck with it, but it might take me 2 years or 3 years to write something that somebody else is going to be able to churn out their book in maybe a different kind of book in less, right? So I try to make sure, like, yeah, I guess when I'm writing, I think more about it on a scene level and ask myself, what does what does this scene do? And does it tell what does it tell me about the characters? How does it propel the story forward, or keep the reader in suspense? And what does it accomplish? And I think as I get deeper into writing, I am more aggressive about cutting out scenes that don't accomplish something significant. I try to value my reader's time, I guess is what I would say, right? And sometimes I read 2 or 3 chapters and I'm like, wow, did anything really happen? Did I learn anything about this character, right? And I say, gosh, I'm not going to get that 2 hours back, right?
Yeah.
I try to be respectful of my readers' time in that way, right? Where it doesn't necessarily all have to be about pace, right, or story or thought, but what do they learn about the character? That this book would have been less if it had been.
Yeah.
But I think that's where I come back to Cormac McCarthy, right? Where maybe not every sentence is beautiful, but every one is necessary. And if you took one more sentence out, his book would be worse. Not that good, and never will be, but right, but that's the ambition, I guess, is a good way to say
I I've read some authors where I wish that they would have taken that a little bit more of that approach, after I've read 5 pages about that tree that I don't care. I don't, I'm skimming.
it.
And then the author says, well, I wanted this series to be done, but I didn't get as far as I want. Well, you spent 5 pages talking about a tree.
Are you talking about Richard Powers?
No, but
Okay.
I have a laundry list of authors that could be on that.
'Cause it's about 500 pages about trees, but that was like, if you could get through that first couple of chapters, it was like, holy cow, everything was necessary in that 500 or 600 pages, or I don't know how long it was, but
No, this particular tree
the
scene I didn't feel
overstories,
was necessary.
the
No.
but yeah, like that. And I said the last book by Cormac before he died, Cormac McCarthy, felt like there was a bunch of stuff in there that unlike the road, it was unnecessary.
As a sentence or paragraph geek, does that ever cause you issues in your own writing? Do you find yourself sucked into trying to make every sentence perfect?
I uh, I would say that I'm not the. Yeah, I read about or hear about other writers who churn a book out in a year or 6 months and start on their next book, and it takes another 6 months. And I guess it boils down to goals, right? I'm trying. I don't really get stuck, right? But I also keep rewriting, so I'm really happy with it. And which is fine, and I don't feel stuck with it. But it might take me 2 years or 3 years to write something that somebody else is going to be able to churn out their book in maybe a different kind of book in less, right?
Mhm.
So I try to make sure, like, yeah, I guess when I'm writing, I think more about it on a scene level and ask
Mm.
myself, what does you know, what does this scene do? And what does it tell me about the characters? How does it propel the story forward or keep the reader in suspense? And what does it accomplish? And I think as I get deeper into writing, I am more aggressive about cutting out scenes that don't accomplish something significant. I try to value my reader's time, I guess is what I would say, right? And sometimes I read 2 or 3 chapters and I'm like, wow, did anything really happen? Did I learn anything
Mm.
about this character, right? And I say, gosh, I'm not going to get that 2 hours back, right? And
Yeah.
I try to be respectful of my readers' time in that way, right? Where it doesn't necessarily all have to be about pace, right, or story or thought, but what do they learn about the character? That this book would have been less if it had been.
Yeah.
But I think that's where I come back to Cormac McCarthy, right? Where maybe not every sentence is beautiful, but every one is necessary. And if you
Mhm.
took one more sentence out, his book would be worse. Not that good, and never will be. But right, but that's the ambition, I guess, is a good way to say
I I've read some authors where I wish that they would have taken that a little bit more of that approach, after I've read 5 pages about that tree that I don't care. I don't, I'm skimming. And then the author says, well, I wanted this series to be done, but I didn't get as far as I want. Well, you spent 5 pages talking about a tree.
Are you talking about Richard Powers?
No, but
Okay.
I have a laundry list of authors that could be on that.
'Cause it's about 500 pages about trees, but that was like, if you could get through that first couple of chapters, it was like, holy cow, everything was necessary in that 500 or 600 pages, or I don't know how long it was, but
No, this particular tree
the
scene I didn't
overstories,
feel was necessary. No.
but yeah, like that. And I said the last book by Cormac before he died, Cormac McCarthy, felt like there was a bunch of stuff in there that unlike the road, it was unnecessary, right? And then I was just like, why is this here? I don't know.
Yeah.
And, you know, he was a really old dude when he wrote that book, and he wrote some masterpieces on the way to that, right? So I'll forgive him for it. But the
Right.
road was like, holy moly, nothing can be taken out of this. He has edited down to the bare bones of essential life questions, right? And it's a hard book to read, but it was a wonderful book to read too.
Yeah. Okay. Let's let people know where they can find you if they want to learn more about you or and your books. So website and any social media that you're active on.
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is Jeff Hoffman writes. There's two N's in Hoffman. And at jeffhoffmanwrites.com, I'm sorry, is the name of my website. You can link to all the socials there. Most I tended to drift away from Twitter, and Facebook is where I to my high school friends, and so tend to post to Instagram.
Okay. All right. Jeff, is there anything that we haven't covered during this time that you want to make sure you highlight?
I just want to highlight how thankful I am that you do this, and that you ask questions about books, because I feel like books remain relevant because they're the one media that really allows you into people's subjectivity, and the fact that you spend your time interviewing writers is thankful for.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to me, not only about Like It Never Happened, but other books and your writing. I really appreciate it.
Take care. I appreciate
Thanks. Thank you again to Jeff for joining me for this conversation. Of course, it is greatly appreciated. As I said at the beginning, if you are a fan of suspense, then you definitely want to check this out. I also do want to say that it is intense, but not really graphic or high on the scary eek factor, which, again, as you know, is kind of my benchmark, whether or not it's going to either keep me up or just really grossed me out. This did neither. It was just intense in a good way, kept me turning those pages, wanting to find out what happened to the main characters in this story. Where were their lives going? How were they going to address the situation that they had been ignoring for 30 years that was now put forward toward them by Kevin's wife, Naomi? What was she going to do with the information that she had? I really wanted to find out what was going to happen, and also what was happening within their relationships, because it's also a story about the relationships that they've built over those 30 years with this huge secret that they've never told anyone, and how that has affected their lives, their relationships, their families, etc. So definitely good on the character arcs and the character developments and the character-driven aspects of those stories. Very low for me on the ick factor. So if that helps, I hope that helps. At any rate, thank you again to Jeff for joining me. I hope that you will join me for the next interview. We are sticking to thrillers. We're back in a thriller mode. That will be The Intruder by Peter Blauner. This is this is a crime or legal thriller, however you want to say that. Apparently I can't say it at all. But it is interesting in that this is a re-release, so 25 years. So we are, it's not historical fiction. It was actually written in the late 90s, but we are going back to the late 90s for this story, and I am looking forward to speaking with Peter. Hope that you will join me for that interview. That will be next Tuesday for that conversation. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this podcast on. That helps the algorithm go out to more readers such as yourselves. It also helps you in that you will always know when there are new episodes because you will get notified about it. You can also follow the podcast on social media: Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Updates, and you'll find out a little bit about each episode as it goes up. Also, if you want to come and chat with me on social media, you can do that on any of those platforms. I would love to hear from you and engage with you. That would be awesome. I hope you're having a great week. It's Tuesday. We're in the beginning of the week. I hope you've got something exciting planned for the week, but maybe it's just work. Maybe it's something
fun. Maybe you're on vacation. I don't know. Whatever you're doing this week, whether it's work, whether it's vacation, whether it's a combination of leisure and work, I don't know what you've got going on, but I hope that you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a really good book. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go